Hey, this is Mrs. Hale coming at you with Chapter 4 information. And I may not cover everything from Chapter 4, but I'll at least touch on the big ideas from it. So one of the big ideas from Chapter 4 is going to be about the Salem witchcraft trials. So I thought I would start off with this meme instead of a fun fact for you. But of course, she coughed while praying. Oh no, you're a witch, which just kind of shows the ridiculousness of the Salem witch trials and the accusations that were thrown at people. But to start off with, I want to in particular talk about the Chesapeake region and their crops and economics and families. So starting off with the Chesapeake region, namely focusing on Virginia and Maryland, is that realize that first people that arrived there were just destroyed by the diseases, malaria, dysentery, typhoid, fever, everything like that. And as a result, not only did it shave about 10 years off your total life expectancy, but then also 50% of the people ended up dying before they even reached their 20th birthday. So because of this, growth is going to be relatively slow at first in this region, mainly because we also have way more dudes than females, than dudettes, if you will. Men outnumbered women 6-1 in 1650. The number did improve by 1700 of 3-2, but it was still really imbalanced. Now, because of this, you have very few families. Most of the marriages would die within, or most of the marriages, would end with the death of a spouse within 7 years. And very few children would grow up to know both of their biological parents, and almost none of them knew a grandparent. And then also about 33% of the women ended up pregnant before they got married. Later on today, I'll explain to you the difference between, Chesapeake and New England society, especially on the family lifestyle here. Now, things in Chesapeake do improve with time. Native-born whites developed the immunities to the diseases. More women ended up coming to the region, and so population grows due to birth rate, things of that nature. Now, the brown gold, as tobacco is known, and I'll be referring to these images here on the right. Realize that as people come to the region, they want to make money and want to survive. Well, in the early 1600s, prior to 1630, tobacco prices were so high that people would make a lot of money. Well, one of the reasons why the price was so high is prior to 1630, we were only exporting 1.5 million pounds of tobacco to England a year, which means basics of supply and demand. Very little supply, high demand in England for the tobacco can set a really high price, as you can see in this table. But as time goes on and more people end up coming to the region, as you can see in this map, the early 1650s and before is the original golden area, but then by 1700, you have all of this green area that's going to be settled. Well, so prior to 1630, 1.5 million pounds of tobacco sent over to England a year. After that point, you're ending up with like 40 million pounds of tobacco sent to England a year. So like I mentioned, supply and demand affects your price, and you're going to have way more tobacco being shipped to England, and people just can't make as much of a living off of it. You then add the fact that you have less cash and tobacco just depletes the soil. And so then farmers will go out and buy more and more acres, hence the growth pattern in that map as well. It's just kind of this vicious cycle that brown gold tobacco creates. So who's going to grow all of this tobacco? And we will talk about slavery here in a moment, but just keep in mind that the birth rate is too low to keep up with your demand for labor. So you start looking for solutions, right? Native Americans can't though, because they die from white man's diseases. African slaves are going to be too expensive in the beginning. And so you look at indentured servants, or what's partly called the headright system. So the indentured servants are going to be people that were paid for, basically their debt was paid off by someone in the colonies, and you were sent to the Americas, and the hope was that within a certain amount of time, your term, you would be released after your term, and then you would have the hope of then owning your own land, earning your own money, that type of idea. But the problem is land becomes scarce. Masters didn't want to give up land. They didn't want to give up money. And so some of these indentured servants were actually forced, or not forced like slavery forced, but like, what are my options? Well, I'm going to work for my previous master for a low wage once I'm actually freed. So indentured servants were used a lot in the Chesapeake region, but so is the headright system. So in Virginia and Maryland, the headright system was to encourage the importation of servant workers. And if, let's say, I'm a wealthier person in the colonies, I could pay for the passage of a laborer. And then I received the right to acquire 50 acres of land. Hence the term head right system. For each labor head I paid for, I would get 50 acres of land. Now, in both of these situations of indentured servitude and the head right system, it's really the masters or the wealthier people that had the benefit from it, not the actual laborer. So this table shows you guys the difference between an indentured servant, the transported convicts, and free immigrants. The categories that I think are interesting, the variables, terms of service, why they like their rationale for immigrating, but then also their social status. So just keep in mind, you can take a look at this later when you have more time, but just kind of interesting the differences between everyone that came over to the Americas. So then talking about the Atlantic slave trade, keep in mind 10 million slaves in total or so came over to the Western Hemisphere, okay? And you are looking about 400,000 of them to North America alone, most of them from West Africa. In this map, okay, the thicker the green line represents the more people that came from that one area. And you might notice that a lot of people, a lot of slaves were actually transported to South America. So just keep in mind that yes, a lot of slaves came to North America, but so did a lot go into Central and Southern America. Keep in mind also that at first colonists could not really afford slaves, especially because you run the risk of someone dying upon arrival. But by the 1680s, there were wage increases in North America, and so planters could start to afford paying for slaves. Blacks do outnumber white servants, eventually. So for example, blacks were half the population in Virginia, and blacks in South Carolina outnumbered whites 2-1. Now, nature of the beast, the Middle Passage, okay? The Middle Passage shown here through this ship here, the death rates is incredibly high, can get as high as 20%. But I don't think it's surprising when you see how people are packed in, laying or sitting on a slave ship, but then also the many different deck layers of the ship. Slaves were going to be auctioned off in North America at ports like Newport, Rhode Island, and Charleston, South Carolina. Now, in your textbook, it'll go into more detail about the culture of slaves here in America, but also realize that we start seeing the legal difference and racism as an institution, okay? So slavery becomes a racial institution based upon your skin color in the early to mid 1600s because of your skin, okay? Now, at first, there wasn't much difference between a white servant and a black slave, but it then becomes abundantly clear, especially by that mid 1600s, as we get slave codes, like the Barbados slave codes that are going to be adopted. Now, some of these slave codes included that you couldn't teach a slave how to read or write because it might incite rebellion. Conversion to Christianity did not matter as much, but also that if you were a slave and you had children, that children or that child became the property of your owner. They were treated like chattel, which is basically a cow, a horse, treating you like an animal. Now, the triangular trade does take part with slavery, okay? So England would export the finished products, right? More often than not, whether to Africa or to the Americas. From Africa, you would get some basic metals like gold, spices, other materials like that. or namely slaves that would get exported. And then the slaves would go to the Americas. You would have sugar, molasses, tobacco, rice, indigo, everything like that. The raw materials, if you will, transported back to England to be turned into manufactured products, and so on and so forth. Hence the nature of triangular trade. This slave trade map is a fascinating link that I have. Several years ago, people pulled together over 20,000 ship voyages, over 315 years, and they digitalized it. And so what you will notice is not only the time counting down up top here, but then also the time increasing with this bar. Now, what you will notice as the years go on is black dots beginning to fly across the middle of your screen from Africa, namely to South America at first. And then every once in a while, you'll see some pop up to Europe. And then you'll start seeing them emerge into North America. Now, I won't play all of this because you can play around with it yourself. But I just wanted to show you, the bigger the black dot, the bigger the ship, because each one of those black dots is an actual ship. And then you will start to notice the frequency of the ships crossing from Western Africa to the Americas. Now, if I were to pause this, what I can do is click on each one of these dots and learn more about them. Of course, the first one I picked doesn't have information, thanks. But like this one here, the Justitia from the Netherlands, okay? It left with 673 people and arrived with 496. You can always click for more info on ship information. This one is the Queen Anne for sailing for the British. Another one left Gambia, okay? Just really fascinating the amount of information that is cross-referenced here and digitalized. And then what you will start to notice as we hit the 1800s, you'll eventually see a shift in the patterns and it starts to slow down. But in particular, notice how it slowed down to North America and into what are now the American states. And the reason is because of the Constitution and one of the compromises that we had when creating it. Now, obviously, we know enough about history that we did not ban slavery in America, but we altered about the importation of slaves at first. So I would encourage you to take a look at that map some more. So another big idea is going to be about rebellions in the colonies. And the first rebellion that we really come across is going to be Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion. And Nathaniel Bacon is shown here in red with his men all behind him against Governor Berkeley here. And we're talking about in Virginia. So Bacon's rebellion is going to be basically the impoverished freemen known as the landless knockabouts. They are going to be young, poor men, and they are going to be disenfranchised, which means that they were originally allowed to vote, and then their right to vote was taken away by the politicians in Virginia. Why? Because the politicians felt that these young, poor men didn't care enough about their country or even about their colony to have the right to vote. And so you add the disenfranchisement, and then you add some other resentments, okay? The lack of good land and women, no support from the government for protection from against the Indians. Also, they resented the taxes, the limited trade opportunities, and so this just burst under Nathaniel Bacon's leadership. Now, Governor Berkeley did refuse to retaliate against the Indian attacks because Governor Berkeley basically benefited economically from the fur trade with the Indians. So he was more self-serving rather than community serving. So what was the actual rebellion and the actions of them? The rebellion attacked the Indians, whether they were friendly or not. They drove Governor Berkeley out of Jamestown and ended up burning the city itself. They plundered, they pilfered, all of that jazz. Bacon ended up dying suddenly from a disease, and with that, so did the rebellion. The biggest part of Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion is going to be his legacy. It's about the economics of the haves versus the have-nots. We start to see the societal distinction between the people that have the power, who own the land, and the people that don't. Okay, the landless knockabouts, if you will. Okay, and I emphasize Bacon's legacy because we'll see this theme reemerge again within the chapter and in future chapters as well. So, looking at societal differences, these should not be surprising. You can read through it, but basically, it would be like the smallest group are the white planters down to the largest group, eventually the slave numbers. Okay. Southern society is very much so set up in a class system. Now, not nearly as class driven as England, but still set up in that manner. Now, New England society, I said we would do a bit of comparison. So with New England society, keep in mind, New England itself is just very different because of their climate and their geography and topography. So in New England, you have, climate is less deadly than the South because it's cooler weather, it's more seasonal, you have clean drinking water from the rivers, and so you have less disease. Now, living here would actually add 10 years to your life compared to living in the old world, and you would live to be about 70 years old or so. Your families are going to be very stable in comparison to the Chesapeake. Families had many children. Women would typically have about 8 to 10 kids in their lifetime. That would be maybe 2 or every second year, every 2 years or so. Now, it does say women came to fear pregnancy, but keep in mind that they did have midwives, and so death in labor was not as common as maybe in the Chesapeake region. Also, because of the strong family structure, sometimes due to the Puritan faith, you had adult families, you had societal structures, you had peaceful society, you had low premarital birth rate compared to the 33% of the brides that walked to the altar while pregnant in the Chesapeake region. Now, keep in mind, men did not have absolute power over their wives, but they did hold power, okay? Divorce was very rare, except in abandonment or in adultery, which means extramarital affairs. Towns did develop because of geography and protection against the Indians, and you also had elementary education that was provided. And eventually, 1636, Harvard is founded. So let's talk, probably my last big topic here for you is going to be about the witches and the church, okay? So let's talk about the Salem witchcraft trials. Some of these images here, you have Giles Corey is being pressed to death here, which means they had a board and would literally load him up with boulders on top. And he was convicted of being a witch or a wizard, and so they pressed him to death. You have people in the gallows and, kind of being made fun of in the community. Here's another image of someone being pressed, and then here's the image of people being accused of being a witch in front of your trial here. So talking about the Salem witchcraft trials, these began in 1692. And a lot of the causes, there's several different causes. One is superstition of the time, right? But namely, it shows the social stratification of the haves versus the have-nots, right? In New England. And also the religious fear of being corrupted by commercialism, wanting more, okay? And so keep in mind, you have the accused come from the families associated with the market economy. The accusers were the farm families, okay? So if I am a farm family, I was blaming the market, the townspeople, for being witches. Now, this does turn into a hunt, okay? And in the end of it, about 20 women were executed. 19 were hanged, one person was pressed, 2 dogs were also hanged. Now, later on, families were given reparations, meaning payment for those that they lost, and their convictions were annulled. So, kind of their families were forgiven. But keep in mind, it shows the difference between the economics of the people living in the town versus the farmers, and then also religion versus commercialism, okay? Now, why some of this was because of church membership, okay? You have something called the halfway covenant. And the halfway covenant was offered by the church, which gave you partial membership rights to people not yet converted in their faith. And you would do that because membership numbers meant more money for your church and community. And so then your religious purity was given up in favor of your membership numbers. So you start seeing a lot of religious problems, maybe in the more New England area, and what's maybe necessarily purified, if you will. So some topics I'm not going to really talk about, but I just did a few slides on. With New England, just keep in mind about Massachusetts Bay democracy with John Winthrop, the legacy of New England, talking about being traders, being less ethnically diverse than the South, their livestock, their shipbuilding and commerce, that they really didn't have much slavery. And then also about New England women and their differences as far as their livelihood compared to like the Chesapeake Bay women. Also, keep in mind with the Native Americans versus the settlers about using land versus owning it. And then the early settler habits in general, between the seasonality, their work habits, their social classes, everything like that. So there's more in chapter 4 than what I covered necessarily, but just kind of interesting topics overall, especially when you are looking at this beginning of slave trade and the beginning of our slavery institution, looking at the economics that develop and a bit of the haves versus have-nots. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.